So I'm going to invite the panel members to kick off on the same two questions, and I'm going to start with Derek for two reasons. One is because he's holding the microphone, but the second one is that the other one is I discovered this morning that we both spent time in the jungles of Central America. I haven't had time to work out what my links are with the other panel members, but Derek, that's as good a reason as any to start with you.
Okay, well,
so on your worry and your opportunities, please.
Well, my worry is that I'll develop the nickname Tarzan now. So, but I guess my biggest worry from having listened today, and I thought today has been really fantastic, is time. The time it takes in Ireland to not only put the policy development together, but to actually implement legislation, particularly legislation in relation to health research. I thought it was interesting that Murish's most recent reference, I think, to relevant health research legislation was the establishment of the HRB, which was a number of years ago. So, and if you look at the current, I guess, delay of the two pieces of legislation that are most relevant, certainly from an IPOSI perspective, is the Health Info Bill, but also the Human Tissue Bill. Have been significantly delayed. So if we're actually talking about introducing new legislation, well, how are we going to get to the stage of where you've got an Irish water situation where you can fast track it? And there's pluses and negatives to fast tracking legislation, but I do think that currently in Ireland we have a problem in terms of implementing and the time it takes. Because certainly from a patient's point of view, and if we take maybe Beth's recommendation that that we first look at the legal basis, or we actually really determine, well, what are the exemptions in terms of consent and broad consent. If you ask patients would be very, very happy with broad consent and would ask you, why are you spending time going through this process? So from that perspective, I do have that worry. That also actually raises an opportunity from my perspective as well. That, and I certainly think that the opportunities presented by patient registries and biobanking were clearly made by both in the last session. But I also think in terms of introducing the public health perspective and the public opinions on this is something that we haven't really done in Ireland. I mean, legislation to me is supposed to reflect the public values and principles of the nation. So if we haven't even had this discussion as a nation in terms of, well, what does broad consent mean in the terms of how that affects secondary use of data? I mean, you can have it in any format you like, whether it be a citizen jury or a town hall meeting. We've never done it in health, and to me that really strikes as a real opportunity certainly for this area.
Thanks, Derek. That's fantastic. Maybe you'd pass on to Anthony there.
Thanks. I'm Anthony Sainz from DCU. I suppose, what am I optimistic about? I'm optimistic that what is the single largest industry in Ireland, which is the healthcare industry, spends 18 billion a year and is run with information systems which would be regarded with contempt if I was running a chain of 5 corner shops. And I assure you that is not an exaggeration in the slightest. I'm familiar with both worlds. We are not at the races. We don't have data for research because we don't have data with which to run our system. That's the most fundamental point. Data for research should be a byproduct of the data for running a system. That is absolutely basic, and it is the case in most other domains. For example, the data that's used to carry out research on traffic flow is largely generated from the data used to manage road systems. It's very logical, very hard to argue with. We are now beginning to get to a point that the management of the system have realized that we cannot go on. We cannot continue to manage our system by sticking our finger in the air and guessing. We actually need information. And there is now serious discussion about how we get that information, how we use that information, how we make that information available internally for the purposes of managing, delivering healthcare services. And a byproduct of that is that we will have information available for research. So that's what I'm optimistic about. What I'm pessimistic about is this. There is clear evidence that healthcare is provided by organisations who largely put their own interests ahead of the interests of their patients, and who largely have no conception that they are in a healthcare system which transcends them and is bigger than them. The organisations always get singled out when these kind of remarks are made at the acute general hospitals, and there have been several striking examples of that recently. But I assure you, this perspective is endemic through the sector. It's not just the hospitals, it is throughout the system. Many of the organisations involved in delivering healthcare do not understand how they can operate to optimise patient outcomes, because they have an organisational perspective what they want to do. And unless we can move to a situation where the key question for an organisation is, what value do you add to patient care? And if an organisation is unable to answer that, why are we paying for you? Will be the next question. Unless we can move to a genuinely patient-centred health service, all the information in the world will only enable us to run our service the way the Americans do. The Americans have an unbelievably efficient healthcare service. It's unbelievably efficient at extracting money from the American market, the American taxpayers and American citizens, and converting it into very large profits and very high salaries for those involved. If you want to be seriously, seriously, seriously rich, your best strategy is to become the CEO of a significantly sized American healthcare group. They are better paid than the CEOs of any other comparable organizations. The CEO of Southern Health, which is one of the larger American healthcare groups, which is currently being investigated by the Attorneys General in 20 states for a variety of frauds with which I will not weary you, is paid more than the CEO of General Motors. So there's an opportunity for anyone with commercial sense.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Kieran now, actually, just to mix it up a little bit, just to confuse you.
Hi, I'm Kieran from Cork. I feel like I'm on blind date, actually. But, sorry.
Kieran, is your mic on there? Just check.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, oh, it is, yeah. Thank you.
I'm not single, I'm married. Very happy. Forgive me, I'm going to be very I might stir the pot a little bit here. Forgive me, I've lived and worked in America in the healthcare system over there. And I worked as an in-house counsel in Chicago. Our hospital was outside Cook County, where they do all the outside shots for ER. I didn't get a walk-on part, very disappointingly. But with the greatest respect to my colleague here from DCU, I'm a little weary of hearing America held up as the bête noire when it comes to healthcare. Yes, there are difficulties in America, but American healthcare does sometimes reach the very highest standards of care. So I think that we should put that in the background. And that comes back to my pessimism point to begin with. I'm getting weary as well, and I was a defense lawyer in the US, the UK, and here in Ireland. And I do, coming from a medical family, I married a doctor. And I have to say, I get very weary of this us and them approach to this issue. That, somehow the patient and the doctor are diametrically opposed to one another. And if we're to follow the very fine example from my colleague Deirdre Madden, the excellent work she did in the current guide for the Irish medical profession, doctors and nurses are supposed to act as partners together, in partnership. And I think that we do sometimes get slightly hung up on particularly human rights issues about consent. And for example, when I was at the previous conference, I don't upset the organisers to mention a conference I was in the Marine Hotel across the city here, instead of the venerable Professor Smith here. I got attacked by a speaker there because she was from a patient representative group and saying that all medical research was inherently wrong and was against patient interest. And I had to utterly reject that contention. I think this us and them approach is wrong. And I think also the developments in informed consent, for example, the Montgomery case in the UK now means a healthcare professional will have to get consent for every step of the treatment process, including, for example, breech delivery in obstetrics. So this us and them approach, I think, has to stop. I'm very positive, though, about the potential to change things. And can I just throw into the pot there one thought, because I also chair a research ethics committee, and this is, in the interest of balance, I'm going to come again, in favour of the patient here. Some of the patient information leaflets, and the great respect to my colleague from Wellcome Trust, some of the information leaflets are not an information leaflet, they're a telephone directory of information. And it's very difficult for a patient to absorb that. Now, in a lot of cases like cystic fibrosis, the excellent presentation we heard there, patients are very aware of their condition, and so maybe they don't need that process of information process. I'm mixing my words up there. However, I think if we could use slightly more layperson's terminology, David mentioned laypersons in terms of the Research Ethics Committee, because any plaintiff solicitor or solicitor acting on behalf of a patient could drive a horse and coach through the idea of, do this patient understand this information? Can they retain it? Can they comprehend it? Can they communicate a decision? On the basis of the information they receive from some organisations running clinical trials, that's a farce. And I think that's where maybe legislation could come in and reinforce the common law rules of understand, retain, comprehend, and communicate. That's the opportunity we have here.
Okay, thanks very much. I didn't intend to skew my gender balance there, but I did. So maybe Mary, you could come in there now and your opportunities and worries.
I'm delighted Kieran mentioned the them and us, because I have no doubt that lots of people in this room have been patients, and lots of people in this room are health service providers. And if you haven't been a patient already, somebody belonging to you has been, and you will be, and all that. So, to my mind, I think we miss it sometimes in the health service, that I think other industries do engage with their end user to find out what it is that end user wants, because it has an impact on the bottom line of that industry. You know, if I'm in a whatever retail business, or dare I say it, the airline industry, we go to find out what it is the people's understanding is of what the product I'm trying to sell or deliver, and what it is you need. And we don't do that very much in healthcare. A lot of what we're talking about here today, I've had an interest in sort of data protection things for a number of years, and I find myself sometimes getting more confused. And the point being is that I think about that a lot. I think about data protection a lot. But a lot of my colleagues that I work with day to day wouldn't stop for a minute to think about data protection. So I kind of wonder, if I'm somebody that thinks about it a lot and I'm confused, what does it mean for others? I think the issue of taking data at the point of care, again, if you were in the retail industry, how you do your data analytics is about the buying kind of habits of your customers or whatever. So I don't think we should be now in this world where our research data, for example, is in a different database than the point of care information. It should be a concept of capturing data once and being able to use it many ways. And I think we do have an opportunity to really get on the board there. So I think there are lots of opportunities. I think the challenge about the fact that the legal basis of our healthcare system, even though in the last few years, for example, in the HSE in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, we've been talking about clinical care programs and integrated care. But when you want to do something around integrated care, what we find is, well, GPs, HSE hospitals, voluntary hospitals, and all sorts of entities are all completely different legal entities. So there isn't really an easy way to actually integrate your services across those various different sectors, and particularly for people with long-term conditions who take a tortuous journey around those various different ways. So I think there's both an opportunity and a challenge to try and do something about that, to try and create some sort of a basis that says if you're a healthcare industry, then it defines that you belong to some legal entity that could allow us to do that. So I think there's a real opportunity to do that. And that kind of thing. So my opportunities would be around looking at the capture of data at the point of care and using that in multiple ways. A few years ago, I'm going to say the dreaded PPARS thing, but like a few years ago, we got into this PPARS world because it was about kind of human resource management and I think financial management. So we went about things kind of the wrong way around. We sometimes think that we have to have financial systems because the most important thing is managing the money. But of course, if we had the clinical systems that really gave us the information about the various different activities for people going through the health service, then we can put a cost beside those. So that in itself becomes the financial management system. So I just see lots of, I see the challenges and opportunities just being two sides of the same coin. So I think if we could do something about the legislative basis that allows us to do integrated care, and something about thinking of clinical data at the point of care as being the basis of what we want to capture.
Thanks very much, Mary. Patricia, could I ask you to share with your worry and your opportunity?
They're probably, I mean, I think this is one of these events that you come to and you leave with a lot more questions than solutions or answers to. So, I mean, I used to think of the data protection regulation, I was quite happy to see the outcome that came, and I kind of considered it like a baby born with wrinkles, that there were some imperfections that needed to be sort of ironed out or whatever, but now I kind of see that there's a lot more to it and a lot more that needs to be done in the implementation and harmonisation of it. For me, the data protection regulation is one of these biggies that goes across all of the other initiatives. It kind of sits on the top of the legislative pile and is something that will demand quite a lot of time over the next couple of years. The good thing is that we have a lot of people here who have a history of the conversations that are still needed within the health research system, that we still need to agree on some of the definitions of what we actually mean so that we have a unified health research voice. That will bring in some of the other players that are necessary, and there is nobody from, as far as I know, from the Data Protection Commissioners here or from the Department of Justice who will be responsible for implementing the implementation legislation for this directive. So we need to actually include a broader scope of people within our discussions. I mean, on the opportunity side of things, I would very much see that looking with another hat on towards the European Horizon 2020 research programme, where there are opportunities, and it is the very same discussions that are happening there with funding for research to actually resolve some of these issues. So looking at the integrated care, including the end user in the impact of the actual research, looking at the call for interoperability of e-health standards that's open until next March. The Scientific Panel for Health, which is looking at the long-term 10-year forecast for health research in Europe, which is has sort of agreed on three things that are important. The data shareage, the data linkage across different cohort studies, across clinical systems, research systems, and also the regulation and the legislation and how these can be put together to facilitate and sort of improve the situation and protect individuals and researchers.
Great, thank you very much, Patricia. You carry it.
Thank you very much. I'll just start maybe by commenting on the fact that probably of all of the panel members, I'm the person that has the least, I suppose, connection with the health research area, in that I'm coming from a council that funds across all areas and all disciplines. So just maybe to say that I'm not immersed in this on a day-to-day basis. However, the Council has a responsibility to fund research under the new National Strategy for Research, responsibility to fund research that impacts on citizens and that will have benefits for society. So clearly health research and other types of research are going to come in under that. So I suppose my comments are going to come very much from the conduct of research perspective itself, and I don't disagree with a lot of the concerns and worries and opportunities that have been outlined already. I suppose from a worry point of view, we've a lot of the comments that have been made have been, and this is totally understandable, have been about the development of our national capacity and infrastructure, both from the point of view of actually enhancing patient care, and then, if you like, flowing from that. I think Anthony said, flowing from that, then you have data and information to do research. And I suppose just one, it's not exactly a worry, but maybe a note of caution just around that, is that in us moving forward on that journey, which has, I think has been acknowledged, has been going quite slowly up to this point, I think we do need to remember to be aware that we are part of the broader European community. There are lots of initiatives out there around these types of challenges, and that we need to learn from those, and indeed hook into maybe what's happening more generally on the European level for the benefit of Irish citizens. So while it's important for us to have our own registers, databases, all that kind of thing. There are things actually we can also learn from other databases, maybe in countries that are more advanced and have open access and that kind of thing. So we need to deal with our national challenges, but maybe not be always totally inward looking, and to be aware of that broader European context for the benefit of our patients and citizens. An example of that would be, as somebody mentioned, I think earlier, the whole area of biobanks and what has been done. I mean, the Danes have done some fantastic things there in the very, very recent past, and have done things actually quite quickly. So there are learnings out there, particularly around infrastructures and hooking up with infrastructures to develop capacity in a European context. The opportunity I would mention, I don't think it's something that has been mentioned today, has got to do with the whole area of embedding gender considerations in research, whether that is preclinical research, clinical research. What does that mean? I can see some people's faces saying, what does she mean by that? What this means is that regardless of the type of research that you are doing, that you actually consider whether or not you should be considering whether there are gender implications in the outcomes from the research, and that you basically backward think about then what should that mean about how you design your research and how you do your research. And this is a big area that is coming at us from the whole European context again. The Council recently held a joint seminar with the Research Council of Norway in Brussels to brief, in fact, representatives from other funding agencies across Europe about what we were doing, because the Irish Research Council is the first council that has embedded gender considerations in research proposals across all of its programmes. So this is going to be something that is going to come at us through FP9 in particular, from the point of view of considerations of research. But it's not just about the research, because obviously considering this is important in of itself, whether you're developing a drug as a pharmaceutical company, or considering different medical interventions. And I suppose I mentioned that as a possible opportunity because it's a whole area that actually really is, I suppose, starting to be considered more, it's growing more. And I think probably if you look at the state of our evolution in actually developing our trial system, both preclinical and clinical trial system, there could be opportunities for Ireland to do something, maybe to step out and take a little bit of a lead. So that to me might be a possible opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. I always find the panel discussion is an opportunity, I suppose, to move beyond our immediate perspectives into that more multidisciplinary and reflective space. So I'd like to invite a discussion, to open up a discussion from the floor, I suppose moving into that more general space a little bit in light of our worries, but also our opportunities. So it's open to yourselves if you've any comments or questions.
Thanks, Sarah. So taking your guide to go above the individual agenda for a moment, just to make a comment, in general, we're here to discuss, I suppose, legislation and what it's going to do for health research. But I think we need to be careful that we don't zone in totally on the pieces of legislation and regard them as the silver bullet. They are very important, they are enablers. But we're having an interesting discussion at the preamble here at this table about the systems and the processes and the culture that wrap around that legislation to make all this health research happen. And I think, just to sound a bit of a warning bell, we've seen over the last 10 years what's happened with public trust in banking, supervisory authorities in the financial sector, and there's quite some questions around politics and some of the modern politics. Research is an institution in which there's still a lot of trust, and we inside it as players, I suppose, have quite a responsibility here, but we're possibly, and I'm putting myself in this bowl, we're possibly a little bit in danger of becoming too relaxed, self-regulating, we'll do it ourselves, bordering on smug about it, just to be contentious. So I guess it's a comment really to point people towards the non-legislative pieces, or even working with the legislation that's there today, the things that we need to do to maintain this kind of trust that will enable the research, the general agenda that is research, and not to kind of wait for a nice piece of legislation to drop out of the sky in May 2018 and sure it'll all be fine.
Okay, thanks very much, Graham. I think we might take one or two more comments and then I'll swing it back to the panel to anyone who wants to address. Or do you all need a bit of warming up? Thanks, Niamh.
Thank you. Peter Learn, Department of Health. Professor Smith always gives a very enthusiastic and knowledgeable presentation, and I always enjoy listening to it. But I'd just like to clarify one point, David, which is what you said about research ethics committees and being able to give consent for patient identifiable information. I think some people might think that the Health Information Bill was actually standing that on its head and introducing explicit consent. If I could just say that research ethics committees never had the power to give consent in relation to patient identifiable information. It was just one of those things that was presumed to be the case. What the Health Information Bill did was, because the Data Protection Commissioner's Office has become much more rigorous in the past 3 years about health information, they have said that you need explicit consent for all health research using patient identifiable information, and we sought to give an exemption to that rule. So rather than being seen as some piece of legislation that has made the situation more difficult, we actually decided to make something positive out of it. But I think it's a bigger issue too about consent, because when Beth was given her presentation on the rules under the EU data protection regulation, and legitimate interest is something that's open to the private sector but not to the public sector, I think it's worth pointing out that the recital to the EU data protection regulation points out that public bodies should not rely on consent. And the reason for that is that public bodies are deemed to have an inappropriate power relationship with patients. So if you like, the HSE, with its annual budget, etc., and an individual patient, it would be felt it can't or shouldn't rely on consent. So I think that we're going to be driven more and more to a legislation basis for all types of the use of health information. Because consent, whether it's explicit, whether it's informed, whether it's broad or otherwise, simply won't be acceptable, because the regulation doesn't think it's appropriate where you have a public body engaging with private citizens.
Okay, thank you very much. We might just swing that back to the panel. I suppose this sense of the legislation, action steps of how we go forward with that, but also then Graham's point around, you know, the processes and the culture. I'm sure a few of you might have something to say on that. Who'd like to respond to those comments? Kieran?
I'm actually delighted somebody from the Department of Health is here, because I have to say, and again, referring to the Health, Safety and Patient Information Bill 2015, if any of you have had insomnia, just download that bill. It'll knock it on the head in no time. I read it out I did my presentation instead of David, and I read it to my daughter, who's 2, and she was out after 3 slides. The problem here is very fundamental, and I totally endorse the comments there that legislation is not a panacea for everything. In the States, for example, they tried to legislate for end-of-life issues. You get into very difficult terminological issues like permanent unconsciousness, life-ending diagnosis, things like that. And with the greatest respect to my colleague from the department, I do have to say that, for example, the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, that was the last piece of legislation to be passed by the outgoing Dáil. You can drop that into your cocktail party conversation this weekend, did you know? But that was the last piece of legislation. I thought it was a very worthy but very overly ambitious piece of legislation, because it sought to deal with ward of court, advanced directives amongst other things, and power of attorney. And I think if we do come to legislate in this area, we should do it in a far more piecemeal issue. The Health Information Patient Safety Bill, which didn't make it through the last Dáil but could well be resurrected by the incoming government, is very interesting as well, because that sort of deal with things ranging from research ethics committees to data protection and so on and so forth. I think legislation needs to be slightly less ambitious and more identified and more simple than we've had in the past. That's just a view.
Any other comment from the panel? Yes, Anthony.
I think Graham has raised the issue of trust, and in relation to data, that's really important. I'm conscious, I chair the Irish Blood Transfusion Service, and we're intimately familiar with data protection issues in our work, because we have a huge amount of not incredibly sensitive identifiable information about patients, but nonetheless identifiable information. I would be quite concerned about how some of our research institutions would react if there was a major data breach. And the American evidence is the commonest way for major data breach is somebody leaves their laptop on a train. And how many of you can put your hand in your heart and say that you know that everyone in your organization encrypts their laptops with patient identifiable information on it? Because it will not suffice as a defense that they should have. The defense would be that you checked and that they had done so. So we have to be very careful about how we manage and handles people's data. You saw the damage that was done in the UK when the revenue lost, I think 500,000 taxpayers' details. They sent them in a CD and it got lost, and then somebody found it. We can't afford to do that. So we have to take the processes and culture around handling data, I think, much more seriously than a lot of us do. And I'm not conscious that researchers get a lot of training or that they get a lot of support, because there's quite a bit of technical and technological support to securely handling data. And I don't see much sign of it in the research institutions I engage with, including my own.
Thanks very much. I'm going to open it up to the floor again for a few more comments or questions. Yeah.
I'd just like to
Andrew,
take maybe
isn't it? Yeah.
Andrew Green from Crumlin Hospital. In terms of trust, we obviously had a major issue about 10 or 15 years ago in relation to organs that are being retained. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the breaches of trust that happened in that situation, both in terms of how communications were handled, and obviously it's not just unique to Ireland, there's also Alderhay as well where the same issues happened, of how patients' confidentiality and consent in relation to very sensitive issues about deceased children were subsequently dealt with. And that's informed a huge amount of how we currently practice in terms of research and the levels of consent that we deal with, probably because we've been burnt. It's taken a long time to get back to that trust. So don't want to be smug, and I don't think one can be. It has happened in the research community before in a big way.
Thank you. Any other comment or question? Yes, of course, Mary, yes.
Is that switch on?
Yes.
Just following on from your point there, do you envisage, though, that in the same way as, we'll say, the organ retention issue became the issue, it became that we could be facing in the future something similar in terms of data, and particularly like if you look down the road of kind of genetics and the fact that my genetics say something about my relatives in Donegal or whatever, so it's not just my information. So in other words, again, it speaks to the business of informed consent. So you speak to somebody today and enroll them in some research that has something to do with genetics, and that tick box that you said at the end, we might use your information or your sample in future research. Just is it possible that in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, people who did sign those things say, well, I didn't really understand that at the time? I mean, what would be the legislative sort of basis for that? I just wonder, are we facing similar kind of issues further down the line unless we kind of, I think, simplify things? Because we can try and wrap ourselves up in all sorts of knots, but if people don't understand it, they'll have some case in the future to say, well, I didn't really understand that at the time. I don't know, I'm not a legal person, but I just wonder, could we be facing something like that?
Okay, thank you very much. Andrew, you want to respond?
Sorry, I'm now changing hats as a geneticist. It's clear that, certainly in relation to the new regulation, that there's specific exemptions about genetic data as kind of additionally sensitive medical information over above sensitive medical information, if my reading of it is right. And the current Disability Act, Part 4 2005, gives protection such that insurers and employers can't access your genetic data for their process data under the Data Protection Acts. So that's currently an Irish legislation that's not actually necessarily in other European countries. Nonetheless, in terms of research, there's a lot of very loose levels of consent that are arranged and are being set up without clarity of thinking of how long data is being held, whether it's being passed to third party, and David's point about incidental findings in relation to genetic testing, which has been a big issue. And then furthermore, the level of anonymity that is presumed isn't necessarily true, because there have been quite a lot of people's genetic data put up anonymously on websites as initially as a scientific sharing exercise, but if you know a small amount of somebody's genetic information, you'll be able to identify them from that database. So a lot of those databases are now being closed off significantly, which is in one respect is respected patient confidentiality, but in another way is actually interfered with the level of communication in relation to research. It's a very tricky issue. I'm not offering any immediate answers, but I think also there is a concern that because of that, wearing my research genetics hat, is that some research ethics committees will just say no because it's too hard, and that actually would impair genetic research rather than learning about it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So just in terms of, I'm going to slightly preempt Jerry's finishing piece here just a little bit in terms of the conversation of moving towards sort of action steps, and we've kind of floored a little bit of our sense of what are our key worries, but we've also tried to think about some opportunities. And I'm just wondering, in terms of what you've heard today in your own sphere of action, what you see as, you know, a concrete step that can take, you know, can begin to actually do something about some of these worries, or even to capitalise on the opportunities that have been raised. Has anybody got a comment to make in response to that challenge that I'm setting you? What can we begin to do? I'll put the panel on the spot if no one in the room has anything to say. Anthony, yeah.
I think we have to bite a bullet here, which is to say that research is actually worth doing. And we have to make the case very clearly to the general public and to the politicians as to why it's worth doing. The flip side of that is we also have to treat research data and research participants correctly, fairly, and legally. But if we don't explain very clearly to people why they should take part in research, they won't. One of the things that's challenging in my own area is that of epidemiology is that participation rates of controls in studies are falling. So it's quite hard to collect controls for the kind of studies that we have traditionally done. And that's partly around cultural change, it's partly around communication. But we have to be very upfront about what we're doing. Graham is right, people trust us to a certain extent, but there's a certain ambiguity about how people view researchers. If you look at trust metrics, people trust they trust doctors a lot for some reason. They trust clergymen, they trust nurses, they trust researchers decidedly less. They trust politicians much less, and they trust journalists even less than that, which is quite impressive. But we have to figure out ways of getting out our values, showing why it is that what we do matters, and showing that we're doing it in a fair, open, and transparent way. And that's a challenge for us, because we're normally very good at communicating with our colleagues. And we have this kind of ritualized dance of communication, which is comprehensible to typically 150 to 200 people on the planet, understand any given paper that each of us produces at a deep level. But we really have to figure out how do we go about communicating with the public. And some research agencies, the HRB is one, Ducaria's outfit or another, have put a lot of work into thinking about how this should be done. But I'm not sure the research community has yet really got behind that. I'm not sure we're putting our shoulders to the wheel about telling people what we're up to.
Thanks very much.
Just
Derek,
to
please.
follow up on that, I think I'm on this panel because I'm representing, the patient voice, and in the lead up to this, I asked some patients from our membership, and two kind of stories stood out. One was, and the blood transfusion service is an interesting one, where the patient just said that, specifically in relation to sharing of patient data, that patient data is like blood. It saves lives, but it's completely harmless to the donor if it's managed correctly. And the second was a more long-winded story, but if you'll indulge me. And they said, imagine yourself on an aeroplane, and the cabin attendant comes down and says, this is a life jacket. It has a 90% chance of failing to open, 10% chance of working. Do you want to use it? Do you want to jump out of the airplane? And to which your answer would be, of course not. Why would I? At which point the cabin attendant says, well, actually, both wings have fallen off and we're headed to the ground. So at that stage, the 90% chance of failure with 10% chance of success becomes the preferred option. So the analogy being that as long as you provide, from a patient's perspective, the right quality and the right kind of information in order for them to make a decision to share, or indeed to make a different choice should they so wish it. That was, I couldn't have summed it up better in terms of sharing the data.
Thank you. Thanks. Patricia, would you like to just come in on a final comment?
Yeah, God, one of the things I would just say is, I mean, any of you who follow the EU sort of discussions on the open science, open innovation, open to the world, I mean, this is all a really big issue for Europe and for people who work within Europe, nationally, regionally, locally, at European level. And one of the things that I know I'm working with my colleague Annalisa is the chair of the European Open Science Cloud Initiative, and to get that right, is going to come to Dublin for 2 days to actually talk to us about open science, talk to us about what the priorities are, what things we need to do, the view and perspective from Europe, and what things need to be implemented at a national level, at a regional level. And really, I suppose I would say that we need to make a bit more time for actually understanding these things and engaging in them. I know we're all very busy, so it's just about taking some time to do that.
Yeah, thank you. You, Kerry, from the Research Council perspective, what would be kind of an action step, or what is it that you think would be a very positive step forward here?
Well, I think I'd have to totally endorse Anthony's comments about, I suppose, information sharing with the public, regardless of what research domain you're actually in, but. At the end of the day, there's a certain amount that the agencies can do themselves, but the research community does need to get behind that, and I think that's going to become increasingly important as things move forward. We now live in an age where there's lots of information available. Whether there's more knowledge available is a different question, but we need to find ways of actually communicating well what actually is happening in health and medical research, so people can really understand and see the benefit, because that in of itself has a feedback loop into. Somebody said to me recently, well, we're doing a particular campaign at the moment, hashtag Love Irish Research, and I was talking to some people about how we target, key influencers and key decision makers, and they made the point that, well, they actually are also members of the general public. Mm-hmm. So I think we just need to work harder at that, and I think it's actually something that's actually. There's a lot of challenges were mentioned today that are actually very big challenges, but from the point of view that something that everybody in this room can do, I think that is definitely something.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think the communication issue is such a huge thing. I mean, I was wondering about today, when you got up this morning, were you wildly excited by the topic of the morning? And I'm not trying to be facetious, but I think I know I was coming kind of thinking to myself, this is an excellent opportunity to inform myself on something that I would find it hard to prioritise in the day-to-day. And I think that maybe the answer there, you carry, is around helping people understand why. To me, it's been spoken about a few times during the morning, but getting into the why. If we can always work on the rationale and see the opportunities, then. Sorry, as one speaker wants to come in there. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne Pearl McDermott, DCU. Just to follow up on the communication issue there, and how, as researchers, we should be communicating more with the public. I think we have to be careful about that as well. Sometimes things that get out in the public domain, the studies are published maybe not in a very high impact journal, or the study is not as rigorous as it should be, and we all know that happens. So I think there has to be some kind of control on that. Maybe some training for researchers. Sometimes it's driven by ego as well. So I think we have to be careful in that space about communicating research. Sometimes it's not ready for prime time, and I think the public get a lot of mixed messages about health research sometimes, and they end up being quite confused. So just
thank you for that. So just, if Kieran or Mary, do you want to make a final remark?
I think it kind of, it's a first cousin of communication, is the whole sort of education piece. And while we're talking about kind of the research community, I guess a lot of the data that the research community wants to use in health research is data that's captured at the point of clinical care. I know I'm saying the same thing. So I think there's something about people at the sort of coalface who capture this data, an education piece with them around respect for data and the whole value of data, because I'm not saying that people don't get it, but it isn't really part of what people go around thinking about every day. And then I wonder how far back in people's education do we need to bring that? You know, do we go back, you know, to secondary school, or is it at undergraduate level? Like, where do we start? Because we're in a world now where a lot of things are data driven, and that's not going away, you know. So I think people need to have a general awareness of the value of data, the respect for data, the integrity of data, all of those kind of things.
Okay, thank you, Mary.
Very briefly, and I was tying with a lot of the good points made by the panel and by our colleagues in the audience this morning. The last thing I'd say about communication and liaising with patients and so on and so forth, on a general point as well, ultimately if these things go wrong with consent and so on, they can end up in the courts. And what we use, and I'm not saying, and I'm saying Anthony's going to accuse me of wrapping myself in the stars and stripes here, but when I was in the States, in the hospital we worked in, we did use mediation instead of litigation as an alternative to sorting out patient issues. I worked in the initial stages of the Parents for Justice campaign. I advised hospitals in regard to that. It goes back to my initial point, us and them. And I think with mediation, we all get to the bottom of what went wrong and how it went wrong. And more often than not, from my experience, and dare I say I've worked in 3 different jurisdictions, all the patients or their family want to know is what happened, can make sure this doesn't happen again. And that sort of communication idea, investing itself into the legal system, I think would be a very, very good step forward, and that's an opportunity for us as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, just with my good pedagogical hat on, I'm going to invite you, as you leave today, to think about your take-home from the morning, and also maybe a talk to, who you're going to talk to about the meeting this morning, who you're going to communicate with. Thank you very much.